Let's now analyze what we got in this project folder we created. I opened it here in Visual Studio Code, and before we dive into the folders and files we got here, two things. First of all, the look of my IDE here. If you don't have the same one and you want the same one, under File, Preferences, Color Theme, you can pick the color theme, and I'm using the Dark Plus theme here. Now, in addition, you very likely have different folder and file icons. You get the same ones as I do if you go to View Extensions and you dare search for Material Icon. Visual Studio Code has support for community extensions, and that is a visual extension, so not related to Power BI visuals, but simply affecting how my IDE looks like. And I got this Material Icon theme installed. And the effect of this theme is simply that the folders and files have different icons. So that's pure cosmetics. You don't need that, but if you want it, that's how you get this look. With that, let's analyze what we got here. And let's start at the top. The .vs Code folder is a pure editor configuration folder. The two files it holds just configure my IDE here, and therefore if you're using a different IDE, for example, you don't even need them, you might not even have them, and you can fully ignore that. The assets folder holds a icon.png file, which is an image, and in general, if your visual would use more images, you would put them there, because from there you could use them in your code later. Since your visual is in the end just a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are all web technologies, you can also embed and use images. Because in the end, your visual is just a mini website hosted by Power BI service, you could say. And therefore, anything you can use on a website can generally also be used in your visual, and images are a part of that. In addition, here you would set up the icon your visual uses in that tool set when users want to use your visual, and that becomes important when we later package our visual, and I'll come back to that, well, later. The dist folder will later then hold our packaged up visual, which is ready to share with other users. Currently it's empty because we're still in development mode, we're still working on the visual. The Node Modules folder holds extra project dependencies which we have here. Our project here uses TypeScript, and when we write the code, we don't want to reinvent the wheel for everything we do, and we will use third-party libraries to make certain things easier for us as a developer. Those libraries are automatically managed and stored here in the Node Modules folder. And therefore, you shouldn't edit this folder, it will be managed for you. In here, for example, you find a bunch of folders that are related to D3, which is a package we'll later use to draw something onto the screen. Now, the source folder holds two .ts files, and .ts, of course, stands for TypeScript. These are the files that hold the actual code you're going to write and you're going to work in, and these are the files we're going to edit throughout this module. I'll come back to those in more detail later, therefore. The style folder holds the visual.less file. Now, styling is done with a language that's called less, and less is a bit like TypeScript for JavaScript. Less is an extension to CSS, and CSS is the official web styling language, you could say. You can also write regular CSS code in here if you want, but less adds some extra features. And for example, here if I change yellow to red, and this PBI-Wiz start process is still running, if we go back to our preview and we reload, you see now the background here is red. So that's how these things are related. And then below that we get a bunch of configuration files. Capabilities.json, for example, controls how Power BI service is able to communicate with our visual. For example, what can be configured from inside Power BI service, which configuration options are exposed to the end user. So that's basically a technical document describing how our visual in code and our visual in Power BI service are able to interact. Now in here we can actually delete something, and that's this objects node. You can fold it by hovering here on the left and clicking on that arrow, and that makes it easy to remove the entire objects node. We don't need it here, and I'll come back to it later. So delete it and save the file thereafter. Package.json and package.json are project management files. They manage the dependencies of our project and a couple of other things, but the dependencies are the most important part. So basically here we specify third-party packages our project uses, like for example D3, this visualization package, which we will use later to draw something onto the screen. Now the dependencies stored here are in the end the projects and their dependencies, which are stored in node modules. That's how this file gets managed in the end. If you would share your entire project with another developer, you could also delete the node modules folder, because it's quite a big folder, so to make it smaller you could delete it. And as long as the package.json file is there, it's easy to recreate this node modules folder. All that would need to be done is that in your project folder, and that's why I'll temporarily quit PBIVis start, in your project folder you can run npm install, and that will look at the package.json file and install all those dependencies and their dependencies into your node modules folder, and it would recreate that folder if it's missing. But that's just a side note. With that, I'm going to bring this PBIVis start process back up so that we can continue developing. Now, the PBIVis.json file is another configuration file for our visual, and at least for me here it's quite unreadable, but we can right-click into it and choose Format Document, or use this shortcut to auto-format this code to be more readable. Now here we can configure our visual, but whereas capabilities.json is basically a file that tells Power BI service how to use our visual, PBIVis.json is a file that is meant for humans. Of course not like this, but the information we store in there, like the description or the display name of our visual, that's all information that shows up in different places. For example, in Power BI service, or if we package and share our visual in things like the app source market. So the configuration here is basically meant for humans. Generally, the configuration here is meant for Power BI service. Now there are some items in PBIVis.json which are also meant for our project setup and for the computer in the end. And that's, for example, assets, where we define which assets we're using. That's the style configuration here, where we basically make clear where our styles are defined, that it's in the visual less file in the style folder. And if you would, for example, change the file name of visual.less, you would therefore need to update it here. But we can keep all the defaults, we don't need to edit anything here. I'll just save the file because I reformatted it. Now the other three files here are there to configure TypeScript, that programming language we're using, and unless you really know what you're doing, you can therefore definitely stick to the defaults there as well. Now with that, let's go back to these TypeScript files up there. And we can actually delete the settings.ts file, we don't need it here. And in visual.ts, we can delete all that green text here at the beginning. That's a comment which we don't need. And now let's see what we have in this file. In there, we got a bunch of imports. Imports are a language feature that tie different files together, that basically help the project know where certain features are coming from. And if you're using a certain feature in a file, you need to specify an import to tell, let's say, the programming language where to find that feature. And for example, here we had an import where we imported something from that file we just deleted. Since I deleted the file, I can also delete this import here. Below that, we have a so-called class. A class is a language construct which basically is best described as a blueprint for an object. But that, of course, leads us to the next question. What's an object? An object is a data structure in programming. And in the end, our visual in code to the computer is such an object, full of information, of commands, and of data. And Power BI service in the end consumes our object. So we're building or we're defining an object here, and Power BI service is then able to use it. Now this class has some properties. These four things here are so-called properties. That's basically data that's stored in this object. Data that we can use in our code, or data that Power BI service might be using. Now that's actually data we only use in our code here. And then we got two so-called methods, the constructor method and the update method. We actually got more, but let's focus on those two. Methods are basically commands that can be executed. So that's code on demand, as I like to call it. And these two methods are required by Power BI service to bring something onto the screen and to update it whenever our data changes. To be precise, the constructor here has all the code that runs when the visual is loaded and constructed for the first time. The update method here, on the other hand, has the code that should execute whenever the data attached to our visual changes. So here, for example, if I add and remove data, this triggers the update method. And the other methods down there are utility methods that were part of that default visual, which we don't need per se though, and which we therefore can just delete. Now, how does Power BI service know that it should run the update method whenever our data changes though? We could have any method name after all here. It's our code, so I could have named this whatever. Well, actually now we're getting an error up here that our class visual incorrectly implements the interface iVisual. That's this part here. This class implements something. It implements a so-called interface. And an interface basically is a contract that forces us to add certain features to that class. To be precise, this iVisual contract, which we sign by implementing this interface, forces us to have an update method. And that happens to ensure that Power BI service is able to call an update method. Because Power BI service wants an update method. It only knows how to call a method named update when our data changed. So in order to ensure that we have such a method, and we don't, by accident for example, name this method differently, our visuals should implement this contract, because this contract tells us that we need that method, and if we then should accidentally forget it or name it differently, we get an error which we can fix. So that's simply an extra, you could say, security mechanism for us as a developer to make sure that we're writing proper code. That's the big picture. It will certainly all become a bit clearer as we write code and as we develop our visual. For the moment, we can do more cleanup work. We can delete these 4 properties, and we can actually also delete all the code in the constructor, not the constructor itself though, just the code in there, and all the code in update. And now we can also delete all the imports which are now slightly grayed out. In my case, the imports from line 10 to line 13. With that, this is a pretty clean and lean file, and we can now use that file to build our visual from the ground up. Of course, if you now reload here in Power BI service, you won't see anything, because now we deleted all the code, so what should be displayed here? But that's where we're going to pick up on, and that's where we will continue with.